anyway, I will just talk about the context or the current situation when it comes to the supply with raw materials. And I talk about, as mentioned by Werner, the Critical Raw Materials Act, especially, and other policies that have been brought up by the European Commission and the European Union to deal with these supply risks, and then come to also this time perspective, short versus long run. First thing is obviously the growing demand of critical raw materials, and we're talking about metals and particularly. And these minerals for energy and mobility transition are the ones that actually drive then the transitions. Here, maybe an NZE is narrow net zero emissions. That's it. And the green bar is only for electric vehicles and storage. And the other ones are solar and wind. So more or less 40 to 50% comes from this transition in the scenarios that they take up from the changes in the mobility and transport sector. And this comes then a dramatic change for specific commodities and specific metals. And the forecast from the European Commission, actually, they demand to increase lithium by the 2030 by 12 times, by 2050 by 21 times. You can see the others. These are a huge growth perspective on these specific metals that are needed for these technologies. And then obviously we can talk about in the discussions about specific sectors or specific commodities or metals. Here's this Sankey charts that are typically used, and these might be familiar also when you think about the Net Zero Industry Act. These are things that come up there, coming from batteries, going down then also to space launches and satellites, drones, etc. So these are the major industrial fields where the new flow from minerals should go to. And then what we've already talked about much is the dependency of China. And what you see on the left-hand side is the extraction side, so the mining side. And then on the right-hand side, the processing steps. So refinery, that we're coming from, basically from metal ores to the metals. And this, especially the second step, takes place in China. So what you can also think about is how this happened. There are two reasons. I'd suggest one thing is that obviously processing capacity moved out of Europe and US towards China because of their availability of lower energy prices, etc. Also environmental conditions and other issues on the legal side, but it also came close to the shift in the manufacturing sector. Obviously, then the manufacturing sector in China demanded these materials. So obviously, this industry moved closer to where manufacturing happens. But actually, it's one thing is to remember. It's key to when you think about resilience and risks and the dependency. It's much more about this processing step, not too much, even though you can also talk about this part of, but it's much more on the processing side. Next step, and it's about the supply risks, and there have been studies by the European Commissions, and it's probably also, again, too many sectors, too many technologies to really look this up in detail. But what they did in their analysis is to see if there is, like, within the value chains of these technologies, what are the risky parts or what are the risky steps in these processes. And what they came up is actually that basically 53 out of 70 supply chain steps over the technologies that they looked at, they see it as critical, meaning that at least 30% of these elements are critical. And Yes, it's just the overall picture is that you have massively red dots. So basically all these steps are critical here. And what could be actually done out of this perspective if you think you want to go to a transition with new technologies, and especially important, you want to build up the manufacturing capacity to actually produce these products within the EU to also decrease the dependency on products from or final products from China. And obviously, it's not a new topic. Interestingly, if you read communication from the European Commission from the 1970s, after the first oil price shock, they read particularly very similar. Actually, the problems have been the same. It has not been an issue very much until 2008, and the European Union has taken up actually several steps, but it has been initiatives. So it was always about the importance about raw materials imports, so the trade policy side, which is based in the as a competition for the European Union. But other things, recycling and etc., came up very more recently. But you nevertheless had in 2008 the raw materials initiatives, which was obviously also triggered by the large price increases and the changes of manufacturing and the growing importance of China. It was initiated by the German industry sector, and obviously it was then in the fields. But it took very long until 2020 when the critical raw materials action plan came up, and this was linked actually then to the Green Deal and the idea to come into this new technologies and also move into the manufacturing sector of these new technologies when it comes from batteries to, and then regain power in wind and solar, etc. But also already in 2020 when it came to the military part and defense issues. So the dual use of raw materials have already been mentioned in 2020. So, and what has been done since that is actually that the Critical Raw Materials Act has been constructed, and it was astonishingly fast process. So the proposal by the European Commission came up in April or March 2024, and the law is already in force since 2 weeks ago. So it's already a European-wide law. It has to be implemented in the national states. It's already there, and it was a very fast process, which also indicates that there is a common sense among all institutions in the European area in this lawmaking issues, that it's like a really drastic dependency on these raw materials. What can you do about them? Obviously, what they did is to think about where to. I come to this in a second. Let's go to this chart, because obviously, as I said, it's the acknowledgement that there is a problem, that there should be something, there should be actions on the European level. This actually entered into lists of critical raw materials. The first one after the initiative in 2008 came up in 2011, and the European Commission is somewhat calculating or classifying raw materials according to the economic importance and the supply risk. This is very similar to the calculations we saw here. Also, the concentration of where the materials comes from, etc. And the new thing, obviously, it increased. We discuss about why it increased. The important change is now came up with 2023 and the Critical Raw Materials Act, because they defined the strategic raw materials out of this critical raw materials, and they have the criteria. They are relevant for the twin transition and for defense or aerospace, and there's a growing demand on the global level, and it might be there might be difficulties to increase capacities in the extraction sector in the very short run. And then out of the 34 critical raw materials, 17 or half of them have been classified now as strategic raw materials. This is important because these raw materials, there have been in the law now specific benchmark classified. So it's the first time also that the EU is saying, okay, where we want to go and very quickly go. Actually, up to 2030, 10% of the consumption of such strategic raw materials should come from the EU. 40% should be from processing capacities, should be processed within the EU. And 25% of the consumption should be from recycling. Plus, they add on the dimension from the imports that not more than 65% should come from a non-EU country. What you have to say is that these are non-binding, so there's no legal consequences if they're not. And what is also clear is that import dependence remains. If you do back of the envelope calculations, it's clear if you address these in all of these strategic raw materials, you still need 30% of unprocessed materials imported and also another 35% processed minerals actually being imported. So that import dependency is not there. What the EU Commission is actually arguing is that it improves the resilience, and especially the resilience of supply chains that have manufacturing or should have manufacturing then in the EU. So it's much more. It's not really. This is not the game changer in the very short run, but is you can have this in the conclusions. And it's also a signaling function for, firstly, for investors that should that want to go for extractive projects in the EU. And actually also for processing, etc. But it should also be a signal for the industries that actually plan to build up battery manufacturing, etc. So the EU is showing with this that they do everything they can to somewhat build up the basis for such manufacturing in the EU. Then how do they do this? Obviously, there are limits then, and we come to the assessment. Can it actually be a game changer? The tools are, or they define strategic projects. So everything that comes from processing and recycling related to this specific strategic raw materials, there should be a facilitation of the permitting processes. Legally, they define any of these projects when they are accepted as public interest. And it also changes, obviously, for instance, the public participation when it comes to environmental impact assessments. It has to be discussed if there are really changes then on the ground in these permitting processes. But what they also include, obviously, then, and what might be more interesting in the long run, is measures on recycling and circular economy, even though they are still vague. They connect somewhat to other initiatives. And the other one is much more about risk monitoring, transparency requirements, etc. It's about data gathering, especially which is then concentrated on the EU Commission, who wants to actually have a better picture about potential risks and then dependencies, etc. And so the assessment that we had in our research report, it's probably not a game changer, especially not for extractive project, because overall lead time, and that's a thing that is generally true worldwide, even in Australia and Canada, an extractive project takes 12 to 15 years to be from the start of exploration to the final digging in the ground, basically. And the permission process takes around, let's say, maximum 3 years. So the long it takes up to build up such project comes from the technological issues when it comes to, if you want to know what type of ore is, how can we actually access it, what type of technology do we need. This takes up 8 to 10 years. And the permitting can be shortened, but it's not the case they probably want to do. But it, as I said, it changes the discourse. Obviously, they want to set clearly that mining and processing project and recycling project are related to green technologies. This interlink is much more, so if you want to have like a greener energy system, you somewhat need to think about mining. So that's the thing that was an important issue, also pronounced by the European Commission. But overall, you have many other challenges. One thing is, obviously, we talked about it, the energy but also labor costs, because it is a competitive and a global industry that we are talking about when it comes to mining and processing. The administrative capacities, if you want to shorten permitting processes, you do a usual impact assessment within with 2 people in 12 months. If you want to shorten it to 3 months, you need 4 times more people. And that's an issue in the administrative budget. So it's one thing if you write into a law that permission processes should take 90 days, and in reality it can't be actually at. And obviously, what you also see is that there are already disadvantages in the technological expertise. There are no major European mining companies. But also the processing and the know-how how to do the processing, for instance, in lithium, cobalt, etc., also moved to China actually with it. So there's obviously some limits. And what was already mentioned before is that obviously the import remains crucial, and the EU and their competences about trade policies actually engaged much more into other tools. One is the strategic raw materials partnerships with countries you mentioned, and I have a map later on, and it increases fast. It's a really easy tool. It's a memorandum of understanding, and it somewhat copies, you could argue, the Chinese ways. So it's like you come up from the top governments or the EU, and the governments in the minerals-rich countries actually come together. They talk about potential projects, etc. And then they also, in the European Union, for instance, they also invite then companies to come to these negotiations and etc. It's much more the soft diplomatic way, which is then contra to the usual approach, which was actually include raw materials chapters in free trade agreements, which are they're mandatory in the meantime for all new free trade agreements, but they are much more on this level playing field and rule-based system that the EU is known for. What is problematic potentially there is the strategic materials partnerships. They always talk about mutual benefit, meaning that there should be value addition, attempts to increase the value addition in the partner countries. But these issues on industrialization, moving up the value chain, and sustainability, they're always as keywords in there, but there's no legal obligations for such issues. You could discuss other tools as well, I don't mention now, but it's you could actually, if from a naive perspective, you could say that's a possibility, because the countries that have the mining capacities and they have the ores, actually they look for higher value addition. And if you are able to integrate them into a manufacturing value chain from the European side, it could be like an outlet. Obviously, as I say, it's naive because it comes to geopolitics and etc. and other ideas. But it could be one element. This is just the map, so it's increasing, and it's from it's December 2023, and in the meantime, they have included or concluded 4 more of these strategic partnerships. Trader most recently. even though they could not agree on a free trade agreement, they could agree on this memorandum of understanding when it comes to raw material. And then maybe one point that I wanted to add to this discussion is this short versus long-term perspective. It's a study by people, and what they see is obviously you have like, especially if you want to speed up the transition in mobility sector and in energy sector, the speed and the time actually that you want to do this, or the time frame, is the crucial one. Obviously, if you want to speed it up very, very fast, the crucial dependencies and potential supply difficulties come up in the first years. But then once you have entered into a stage, and when I mentioned it before, and you have then the renewable energies, you have the electric vehicles on the ground, then you have somewhat fulfilled transition. Then it changes. Then the imports actually, it's probably a peak, but then they go down, and then in the long run you might up end in the circular economy situation where the supply of the raw materials actually comes much more from recycling rather than primary sources. And that's a thing, but it's obviously the crucial periods is now the next decade, let's say. And yeah, it's just also, it's a technical issue because obviously more you need for more recycling, you need the batteries, etc. For lithium, this builds up. But the lifetime of a battery is 12 to 15 years, and then it can be recycled. So this is also coming up in these time frames. But it might be also a perspective why you build it up and what could be then the scenario for 2050 once you complete it. From my side.